Hello, everyone, and good morning from Washington, D.C. I hope you are well. My name is Amy McKinnon. I'm a staff writer here with Foreign Policy magazine, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this foreign policy virtual dialogue on women, peace, and security. 20 years after the UN Security Council's landmark Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, the world is experiencing a new wave of security threats, from climate change to increased political volatility to the global coronavirus pandemic. What isn't new, however, is that women continue to be differentially impacted by these challenges. Today's conversation will examine how the Women, Peace and Security foreign policy framework can be leveraged to help us grapple with these global challenges, how different stakeholders can shape the next stage of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and advance meaningful action on these issues. Before we begin, I want to say a big thank you to our partners at Our Secure Future for their support and collaboration with this program today. And a few quick housekeeping notes before we dive into the conversation. For those of you logged in on the Zoom app, you will see, oh, I have lost my notes. What's going on? One moment, please. For those of you on the Zoom app, you will see a Q&A box at the bottom. Please submit your questions there for our distinguished guests, and we will address as many of them as we can during the Q&A section at the end of the session today. And for those who are joining us via the phone or watching the live stream, you can submit your questions via email to events@foreignpolicy.com. That's events@foreignpolicy.com. And however you choose to submit your questions, please remember to include your name, your affiliation, and which of our panelists your question is directed to. And lastly, we would love for you to join the conversation on social media using our hashtags. We have two today. That's hashtag FP1325@20 and hashtag FP Women, Peace and Security. I think you can see that on our holding slide there in case you didn't catch that. And so now let's get started with the program. First up, for a global and international relations perspective on this issue, I would like to welcome to our Zoom platform, Jacqueline O'Neill, Canada's first ambassador for Women, Peace and Security. In her role, she advises ministers of foreign affairs, defense, and numerous other departments engaged in implementing Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. Ambassador O'Neill, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
So you've been working on the issues of women, peace and security for many, many years, most of your career. Why did Canada decide to create this high-level diplomatic position devoted exclusively to women, peace and security?
Thanks. I'd say women, peace and security as a concept has been important to Canada for a long time. So unfortunately, the last time that we were on the Security Council was 20 years ago in the year 2000. When this very formative resolution was passed. And we were very proud supporters of this original resolution around women, peace and security back then, supporting Ambassador Chowdhury, who we're going to hear from later, so Bangladesh, Namibia, Jamaica, et cetera. And it fit within this frame of human security that Canada was really asserting at the time. And very briefly, the connection being that ensuring women have an ability to influence the decisions that affect their own lives, particularly as it relates to war and peace, is both a human rights issue and it's an approach to increase meaningful security for everyone. So that was 20 years ago. Since then, we've had two national action plans. The first one was in 2011 under a conservative government. The first one now under a liberal government in 2017. And, I'd say the story of women, peace and security everywhere is the same as it is in Canada. And it's always been driven by civil society. So that's how we got this first resolution, was women in particular from around the world, working on the Security Council to get this resolution. And it's really no exaggeration to say that that's in large part how my position was created. We have a really vibrant civil society in Canada. And while they'd seen progress in terms of our government taking specific steps to implement this work, they wanted faster and deeper and more coordination. And they said that, what they wanted and what Parliament also wanted was a high-level champion that spanned the different departments. And so they were very clear with me and with the government from the outset that my primary goal needs to be on strengthening Canada's commitments and not on, just as they said, going around the world talking about how great Canada is. So I have very much a domestic implementation focus as well as an international look.
And very few countries have actually created dedicated envoys for women, peace and security. What impact did the creation of your role have for Canada's work in this area?
Well, what I'm trying to do is focus on, as I mentioned, on a few things. So one is on coordinating and bringing together different departments. So right now we have 8 departments and 1 agency, our national police, that are part of our national effort on women, peace and security. And I think one of the things that's really one of the interesting elements of Canada's National Action Plan is that it's both international and domestic focused. And so as you know, often in government, it's very natural to work within your department and more challenging to work across departments. So trying to do that. Also trying to get people some more tools and resources to do this work. I think often we have an assumption that if you're someone who believes in gender equality, you will automatically know how to do a gender analysis of a conflict or to engage in meaningful consultations with women in communities, et cetera. But we're learning things. There are aspects of this work that we can develop and get better at. So trying to ensure that we're getting more tools and guidance in the hands of people who are in frontline positions, essentially. And then also just ensuring we're as ambitious as possible. So whenever something is important to a government, you want to make sure that that you're never being complacent. You're identifying where there's kind of kinks in the system and pushing further and further to say, how can we be as ambitious as possible in implementing this work? So that's the type of thing that I do.
Great. And when I was reading Canada's most recent National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, it mentions the role of the Gender-Based Analysis Plus tool. I was wondering if you could just explain to us, I thought it was fascinating, if you could just explain to us briefly what that is and how it has shaped Canada's work on this issue.
Be still my heart, Gender-Based Analysis Plus is one of my favorite things on earth, and I could talk about it forever. So the idea, what it is a tool for analyzing how any process, policy, program might differently affect people of different genders. So men, women, boys, girls, or people of different gender identities. And the plus part also speaks to other factors of your identity. So race, ethnicity, income level, rural or urban, disability, sexual orientation, et cetera. So it's a way of this, people talk about intersectionality. It's a way of thinking about, do policies affect, obviously they do affect people in different ways. So about 20 or so, almost 25 years ago, people started using it within Canada and different parts of government. And we've gotten to the point now where any submission to our Treasury Board, so anybody that's actually going to control the money, has to do a gender-based analysis with any of those policy proposals. And so it's something that we practice across government. And the idea is not that just understanding it is the end point alone, but the idea is assuming that different groups will experience policies differently, and you need to take that into consideration. So I could give you a ton of examples of how it works, but one really basic one is our Royal Canadian Mounted Police have been struggling to have women apply to be promoted within the system. So there are, of course, significant disparities then at higher levels of leadership. And so they did a gender-based analysis process on the recruitment, on the process that they were using. And one thing they found was that the process for applying for promotions within the police service, you could apply once a year, and that time was in September. So as you can imagine, for people with young children, that is probably the worst time of the year to apply for a promotion. And you ended up with a disproportionate number of caregivers of young children being women. So women were not applying. So they changed the system so that you can apply anytime throughout the year for promotion. and it increased the recruitment or the applications by women by about 12%. Very, very minor example, but where applying GBA plus helped achieve a policy goal. I could give you about 55,000 more examples. I call it our goddamn national treasures, gender-based analysis plus, and that's one of the ways that we both incorporate this work in our national action plan and think about it across the peace and defense spectrum.
That's great. And you mentioned earlier that your role has, you wear both kind of domestic and international hats on this issue. Could you just explain for us briefly, how your approaches differ when you're dealing with issues within Canada and then looking abroad?
Sure. I mean, the essence of what we're trying to do is the same, which is to ensure that people are able to have a voice in decisions that affect their lives, and to recognize that women are often disproportionately prevented from doing so. So the idea is, what within our system are barriers that we have advertently or inadvertently put up to women having that voice in decisions that affect their own lives. So internationally, we engage in it with other countries, with the United Nations. We try to support civil society around the world, and we deal with it in a partnership way. Domestically, Indigenous women in particular face enormous challenges. We have much, much higher rates of violence against Indigenous women than against any other group in Canada. They're living at the nexus of colonialism, racism, sexism, and dealing with horrific legacies of violence as well. And so we have particular groups within Canada, for example, that are facing specific barriers to accessing their full rights to influence decision making. And so that's one example of ways that domestically we're incorporating this work. But what I'd say is that something that's very clear is that domestic and international policies, and approaches need to be coherent. So the fact that we've had a strong women's movement in Canada for many, many years, that we have this gender-based analysis plus language to talk about within domestic focused departments, that we have an attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, means that we're not internationally looking at one thing and then domestically trying to do another. Obviously, it's not perfect, and I don't mean to paint that picture, just to say that this domestic international coherence is something that's important for the quality of the work that we do. And it's also important because, as you know, there's diminishing ability for anyone to put up with hypocrisy globally. And so we have to make sure that we are not preaching something abroad that we're not practicing at home. And reconciling that is obviously a huge, huge, important challenge to have to rise to meet.
That's a really interesting point. And I mean, looking ahead now to the ways in which the pandemic is just obviously going to shake up the world, both in terms of an economic crisis, it's fueling political crises. There's greater risks of famine and hunger. How are you in your role preparing to deal with these challenges through the lens of women, peace, and security?
Sure. Well, as you know, we're facing a whole range of threats, as you talked about in your opening. So women, peace, and security as a lens is about expanding the concept of security. It's not security is not just defined by where borders are drawn or what degree of physical might a country has over another, but it's really being free from threats in all aspects of your life. So the pandemic, I think, should be a reminder that we need to broaden our understanding of what made us secure, this enormous dynamic affecting all of us. All of the tanks and guns and weapons in the world were powerless in the face of people dying from disease, of people starving to death, of people being beaten by intimate partners in their home. And I worry a bit that this is going to be a lesson we're not going to learn. We're just going to observe and kind of move past. So that's one big factor. We're also dealing with a whole range of other factors. So authoritarianism, the rise of these kind of strongman governments that are exploiting the pandemic in particular to crack down on citizens, and they're organizing and mobilizing on their freedom of speech, on their ability to gather is a huge issue. Populism, nationalism, and an associated backlash against women's rights is massive. And I think we're actually sliding back in terms of both government actions and in some cases public opinion about women's rights. And we're seeing coalitions forming, interesting alliances forming at the UN and elsewhere who are being united by this idea of restoring the quote unquote natural family, or opposing what they're calling gender ideology. And so that's a really crucial dynamic. One of the other things, I think is very important to think about is the rise of China. And Rigetz has written about how, China has really increased its financial and military and diplomatic support to a whole range of countries, in the process influencing its own influence, or increasing its own influence. And China, of course, has a strong aversion to any external support that's conditioned on democratic governance and human rights enforcement, all of which have been strong entry points for women, peace, and security advocates. So you mentioned also cyber, climate change. We're really still trying to make the case that there are deeply gendered dimensions to all of them. We can talk about those separately. But the other thing I just want to end with is that those are many of the overt threats that we're dealing with. I think there are also a lot of subtle, much more subtle ones. And I think we're at the phase where everybody kind of knows what they're supposed to say about gender equality or the importance of women. And it's become a bit performative, I think, among many communities. At the end of this month, there'll be a big debate at the Security Council, and you will hear the most spectacular rhetoric on these issues. And if you listen to it in a vacuum, you would think we have arrived and there are no more challenges. But we have a lot of challenge of people saying the right things and then not committing to it. So they'll launch a very, very slow process, or more likely not resource it. So we have 85 national action plans in the world right now. 4 out of 5 of them have no budgets, or they will punt the work to committees that are ineffective or kind of feckless, or they'll ask for more and more and more research before they take action. So we have a lot of challenges that we're dealing with, and those are some of the ways that we're thinking about them through women, peace, and security lens.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I think you laid out the challenges with regards to this issue going forward, which we're hoping to unpack later on in the event. Please stay with us, and we would love to have you join us in the Q&A section at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am now pleased to introduce our next distinguished speaker, who will help to introduce a US perspective on these issues, what is and should be done to support implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the policy level. Welcome to the program, Congresswoman Lois Frankel, who is the co-chair of the Women, Peace and Security Caucus. Congresswoman, please can you unmute your mic and turn on your video?
I did.
Ah, there we are.
Hello, yeah.
Welcome, Congresswoman. So could you just outline for us how it is that you got to be involved in women, peace and security matters, and why have you made this an important part of your work as a member of Congress?
First of all, thank you so much. Good to be with you and the other panelists. I think I've been on a Zoom with them a couple of times. So really, I think the 2 driving forces. One is I've come to the issue as an ardent feminist, and also a mother of a United States Marine War veteran who fought in 2 wars. I grew up, my childhood was really in the 50s and the 60s, and things were very different in terms of opportunities for girls and women. Those were the days girls didn't get sports scholarships. They were not getting into colleges the way young men were. Women couldn't be on jury duty, couldn't get credit in their own name. I could go on and on. So, I feel like my whole life have been, every step forward was someone trying to push me back, but I did okay. So, but I think that's how a lot of women have felt. And so it's, for me, a lot of my life issues has been trying to advance girls and women. And that's reason, my core value being that when girls are women and women are healthy, when they're safe, when they're educated, when they have access to resources so they could be economically secure, not only are they in a better position with their families, but their communities are more prosperous and peaceful, and so is the world. Now, now how did I get into the security situation is if you look over my left shoulder, I think it's my left shoulder, I'm going to point to it. You can see that's my son, Ben, who, and he, just everybody, he's home safe, he's good. He's given me a grandchild and another one on the way. So, but he was in both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was, for me, a very frightening experience. So when I went to Congress, I said to myself, I'm going to try to learn everything about the world that I can. And, you know, here's the thing. I had been the mayor of my city and the state legislature, and I really had dealt mostly with domestic issues. So I said, I'm going to learn about the world because I want to make decisions. I don't ever want to have to send somebody else's child to a war without being fully informed. So I was fortunate. I joined the Foreign Affairs Committee, and then this is before the pandemic, and I spent 6 years traveling the world, not places that most people would go on a vacation, but boy, was it eye-opening. And I got an opportunity really to meet not only with world leaders, but with civic society. I got to see, just to give you an example, in Malawi, in villages where I saw young girls who were trying to get educated, and the obstacles that were created, schools and long distances away, and there would be violence they would be attacked on the way to school. I went in fact, to Nigeria when Boko Haram kidnapped those schoolgirls to inquire about that. And really, in the height of ISIS, I was in Jordan and Tunisia, and we were shown internet sites where ISIS were advertising women online as a recruiting tool for men to come, and here you can have this woman can be your wife or whatever. So it really, sort of, again, I said to myself, what's happening to girls and women around the world, really, if we don't improve their status, we're not going to improve the peacefulness and security of the world. So that's really, I guess, you asked me how I got into it. It's really, just say this is not a silo for me. It's not, hey, I'm involved in this caucus, because I see this as part, as I said, women have to be educated, they have to be safe, they have to be healthy, they have to have, financial resources. This is part of the whole thing.
Thank you for that very, very moving introduction to your how you got into this role. I'm just wondering, going back to what you mentioned about your travel around the world. We often discuss the position of women and girls in conflict from the lens of victimhood, right? Because they are so often at the very sharp end of conflicts and crises. But I'm just wondering, in your visits to these countries, what did you learn about what empowering women and girls can do to help resolve conflicts and bring people to the table?
Well, women, I'm going to talk about, I could talk about both, but they are involved as relatives, as caretakers, politicians. They could be peace activists, they can be combatants. I mean, there's not any one role for women in society, but let's just take some examples. Mothers have such an influence over their family's life. And so a mother can play such a large role as to whether, for example, her son becomes indoctrinated and becomes a terrorist. I mean, that's why it's so important, for example, that women are educated. Same thing with, we also know that women can become combatants. And so again, I'm going to go back to education again. I'm going to go back to just fundamentals of how the women's roles in society can be leveraged in a way to make their communities much more peaceful and much more prosperous. And really, where communities are more prosperous, for example, you're going to find more peace. Where women are active at the peace table, research shows that peace treaties last longer. So there are a lot of different roles for women and for girls. But again, going back to the theme of let's make sure that if you cover the basics, it's going to make their community a better place to live.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we are doing a whistle-stop tour around our guests today. But please stay with us if you can, as we would love to bring you back for the Q&A section later on in the program.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. So before we move on, I just want to remind our audience to please keep sending in your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you're joining us via Zoom. And if you're dialing in or watching the live stream, you can send your questions in via email to events@foreignpolicy.com. And if you're joining the discussion on Twitter, and we do hope you will, we have 2 hashtags today. It's hashtag FP1325@20. Nice and catchy, and hashtag FP Women Peace Security. That one might be a little bit easier. Now, we want to broaden the scope of this discussion to include a number of distinguished voices and experts who will bring a multifaceted perspective of their expertise and experience on how we can utilize the Women, Peace and Security framework to not only grapple with the current security threats, but to help us anticipate and mitigate future challenges. It is my pleasure to be joined by General John Allen, the President of the Brookings Institution, Ambassador Anwarul K. Chowdhury, former Undersecretary General of the United Nations and the initiator of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 as the President of the UN Security Council back in March 2000, and Catherine Marr, the CEO of the Wikimedia Foundation. Welcome all. Please turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves for our conversation. So as this year marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1325, I think it only makes sense to begin with you, Ambassador Chowdhury. I was wondering if you could talk us through the genesis of the resolution and what was the reaction to it at the time?
Well, thank you for inviting me to take part here. And I would take the advantage of this occasion to wish all of you a happy anniversary. This is the civil society pin for commemorating the 20th anniversary. So I bring all of you to my greetings, and if you all want, let me know, I'll share this with you. 1325, as you said, was adopted 20 years ago in October, 31st of October. But the story goes 8 months behind. And that was in March 2000 when I assumed the presidency of the Security Council. And as is the practice, on the first day of the month, the president announces what is his or her program of work. And I announced, motivated by the fact that if we are serious about peace, we need to take women seriously. And that was my motivation. And I have been working after Beijing 1995 conference to promote that angle. And then I announced that on the 8th of March, 8 days after I announced my program, on the International Women's Day, we will have a resolution emphasizing the role and contribution of women that they have been making all through to preventing war, to building peace. So that was the approach. And unfortunately, the permanent 5 members were very much against it. They really started all kinds of manipulations and machinations to dissuade me from going ahead with my objective. And they really stonewalled till the end. And then within 5th of March, I found that my initiative will be frustrated. There will be no resolution. But I didn't want, because they at least accepted my point that women have a role. Before that year, 2055 years, the United Nations has been only focusing on women as victims. Victims of war, victims of refugees, victims of rape, and everything. No real recognition of their contribution. So my point was accepted by them in principle. So I said on the 5th of March that can we then have a conceptual statement accepting these points? And I thought I should leave something behind as I end my presidency. So that was possible. And that statement affirmed that peace is inextricably linked with equality between women and men. And it also affirmed the value of full and effective participation of women in peace negotiations and matters dealing with peace and security. So that was a big point, and I think we had to work for 8 more months to turn that into a resolution. And that was during presidency of Namibia on the final day of October that happened.
And what a legacy to have left behind of your presidency. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, for that introduction to this issue. And I think I'm going to have to take you up on your offer of a 1325 pin. I now want to turn to Catherine Marr of the Wikimedia Foundation. Catherine, when we talk about the obstacles that women are facing globally, we need to talk also about the technology platforms that are now pervading our lives. What can the weaponization of online discourse about women tell us about the challenges that we should prepare for in the future?
Thank you. And Ambassador, I too will take you up on an offer of that pin and wear it proudly. So in the technology sector, one of the things that's very true and has historically been true for many years is that the vast majority of people who participate in the production of technology, that is the engineers who build and the designers who build the products and platforms that we use, have historically been men. And that is consistently the case today for the majority of the larger technology companies and platforms. What that means is that many of these tools are designed from a perspective that doesn't take a gender critical lens, as we were hearing at the outset from the ambassador from Canada, that integrates and understands what these intersections of not just gender, but race, socioeconomic class, privilege, and access actually mean. And historically, what we have seen is that very often the targeting and harassment of marginalized groups or the exclusion of marginalized and minority communities is a harbinger of what's to come in terms of the ways that these platforms can be abused or misapplied. And so from some of our largest technology platforms that are out there today to some of the smaller, more niche ones, what we have historically seen is that ways in which these platforms are abused often are trialed against minority groups and women in particular. So some of the ways in which right-wing or neo-fascist or populist groups have been organizing more publicly in the political square dates back to 2013 and 2014 with targeted campaigns against women in groups that were previously sort of excluded or at the margins of society. And so when we look to understand the use of technology globally, what we should always look to is how does this impact those who are most excluded? But what we also need to understand is how does the design of these products from the very get-go, and how does the incorporation of a more intersectional critical lens actually help inform the production of tech platforms and products that make our societies more peaceful, hopefully more cooperative and more informed.
That's interesting. So like in the real world and the online world, women often being part of that early warning system, right? When conflicts are brewing.
That's right. And I think it's really important what the ambassador just spoke to, which is that women are often also seen as sort of marginalized groups to design for. And so one of the things that's really, truly critical, and we care very much about at the Wikimedia Foundation, is bringing them into the participation in the design of products and platforms themselves. So what are the policies by which we should abide? How are the ways these products and platforms are intended to be used? And what are the implications they may have for otherwise excluded communities? When you don't holistically engage all sort of representatives or stakeholders, it's very easy to unintentionally exclude or design for unwanted outcomes. So yes, it is true that women are often the early warning sign, but it is also the case that by bringing them into the beginning, as we've heard, having an active role in whether it's peacemaking, policy making, or technology building, we tend to be able to avoid some of these really adverse outcomes.
That's a really great point. I want to bring General Allen into the discussion now. General Allen, after almost 2 decades of a very tight focus on counterterrorism when it comes to global security, we're now seeing a shift towards renewed great power competition and a much more multipolar form of competition at that. What role do you see the women, peace and security agenda playing amidst this shift?
First, let me foreign policy for the 20-year anniversary. Who was a hero for
Ambassador Allen, sorry, General Allen, we're struggling to hear you there. So I think I may move on to another panelist, and hopefully you can cooperate with our tech team behind the scenes, and we'll figure out what's going on there. Ambassador, sorry, say that again. I don't think so. Unfortunately, I'm going to bring in Ambassador Chowdhury back in now. As Ambassador O'Neill mentioned earlier in her introductory remarks, that as of this year, less than half of all UN member states, 43%, have national action plans to implement the Women, Peace and Security Resolution, and far fewer still have actually allocated budget for its implementation. Why haven't more countries devised roadmaps for this issue, and what needs to be done to help close the gap on that?
I think the main challenge is not enough encouragement from the leadership of the United Nations, if I may say. It is absolutely necessary. During the 15th anniversary, we, civil society, who had been always with me, supporting me and encouraging me to move ahead, even after I left my former positions, we have been trying to make 100 national actions plan as our goal. And even we later on shifted the goal to 20th anniversary, but still 85 countries. I believe that most of the developing countries have not yet put the 1325 implementation and as the foremost agenda of their governments. I will tell you this Secretary General has to bring this to the attention of the member states. Article 25 of the United Nations Charter mentions that all member states accept and agree to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. That is the essential strength of Security Council Resolution 1325. So that he as the head of the UN Secretariat, he should bring to the attentions of the countries that you are failing with regard to your charter obligations. And that is one. Secondly, I believe that UN team in each of the countries, particularly I have in mind countries like my country, Bangladesh, and other developing countries, they sometimes complain that we do not have technical capacity or some seed money to start the National Action Plan. Secretary General should advise or instruct his team on the ground to say, render every possible help to get this done. UN has the capacity, UN has the money, UN has the ability to do it, but preparing National Action Plan has never been on the topmost level of the agenda. Secretary General meets every year with, now of course COVID-19 not any more meeting, but before that he met hundreds of heads of state and heads of government. In his talking point, never a mention of 1325. And that is a sad reflection on the leadership that we need in the United Nations.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we have General Allen back with us. General Allen, are you here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, that's much better. So back to my question, where do you see the role, what role do you see women, peace and security playing in this shift towards renewed great power competition and a more kind of multipolar, more players in this great power game?
Well, a couple of things. First, it's great to see Ambassador Chowdhury, who, of course, is a hero to so many of us for the work that he did on 1325. Really was groundbreaking, and we can't thank you enough in the United States for this. It's wonderful to see Jackie O'Neill. Canada was always an exemplar for all of the rest of us in the multinational coalitions in which I worked as again, a nation that stood for something with respect to women. Congresswoman Frankel, as a Marine and having been a senior leader in the Corps, we have always honored the parents of Marines, and we know what you go through when they're in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So thank you for raising that son and for your patience with him as he was in the Corps. Look, 1325, I think, has given us a platform for the kinds of thinking that's necessary in this moment of great power competition. The United States, in so many ways, frankly, has not fulfilled its inherent responsibility to advocate on behalf of the role of women in international organizations and multilateralism. And it's countries like Canada, it's people like Ambassador Chowdhury who have made the differences, who have given us the opportunity to see with great clarity the role that women can play in international organizations, particularly in this moment of great power competition. The United States, this America First policy, whatever that means, has in fact withdrawn from its traditional transformational role in multilateral organizations. And so great power competition is going to ultimately be defined in many respects for the democracies in the world and those for whom the rights of women are important. By our capacity to use multilateral platforms, both to reinforce the role of women in society and civil society, to protect the rights of women, to rescue women from difficult situations and to prepare them ultimately, systematically prepare them for important roles in their societies. So I think that there has never been a more important time, frankly, for the role of women in peace and security. Because as this great power competition continues to unfold, the democracies that are, as you said earlier, Amy, the democracies that are under increasing pressure from authoritarian regimes and strongmen who would use this moment of COVID and economic downturn to seize additional authoritarian power, we've got to do all we can in this moment to reinforce the women in civil society, to prepare women for leadership roles, ultimately to take important positions in governments and multilateral organizations, and very importantly, to have women play important roles in conflict resolution and peacemaking and the peace process. I'm really disappointed in the US government right now for having left women out of its principal stipulations in the Afghan peace agreement that we cut separately with the Taliban. No Afghan government was at the table. And we walked away from that and left the future of women in Afghanistan, ultimately to the Taliban and to the beleaguered Ghani government. And I think that was a moral failure on the part of the United States. And we in the international community should have put stipulations into that plan. That's how, in a world of increasing competition, that's how the democracies and that's how countries for whom the rights of women and the future of women in our societies, that's how you register our commitment to that under 1325. So it's a difficult time, but I think women are a large part of the solution at this moment, and we've got an absolute obligation to involve them at every level of government in an intersectional way to protect them and to harvest the full potential of women. And we've got an absolute responsibility now. It's never been more important given the moment that we're in.
And just staying with you for a moment, General, you mentioned that the US has not fulfilled its obligations with regards to women, peace and security, and of course, particularly in Afghanistan. Who needs to step into that void that the US has left? Is it other countries, international agencies? Where do you see that going?
Sure. First, I make a distinction frequently when I'm speaking with friends and colleagues like this that there's a difference between U.S. leadership and American leadership. And we're not seeing much U.S. leadership in this area right now, just as we're not seeing much U.S. leadership on climate and much U.S. leadership on the Sustainable Development Goals, et cetera. But there's still plenty of American leadership out there. Many American NGOs, many American think tanks, many Americans who are poised potentially to enter a new administration, should one be voted in after the 3rd of November, who are in fact committed to this. But in the meantime, organizations like the EU, countries like Canada, the Nordic states, there are many countries who walk the talk, who in fact are exemplars of how they have made conscious efforts per 1325, but just frankly their own cultures, to celebrate the role of women in society and give them ultimately the opportunity to take their rightful position in society. Not for tokenism purposes, but because it has to be the culture. And so we need to see multilateral efforts until the United States regains its sense of commitment in this area. We have to see multilateral efforts ultimately that can fill in the void. Because I'll tell you who will fill in the void if we don't, and that'll be the Chinese, and that'll be the Russians, and that'll be the authoritarians, who will give lip service to the idea that women are important in society. But when you peel back the rhetoric, you see there's a very different reality to it.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, General Allen. I want to turn back to you, Catherine. You mentioned earlier about the importance of having women involved in the process of designing technology products and platforms. What can the technology industry do to play a more active role in promoting the agency, leadership, and security for women, and in creating more digital spaces that support and promote women?
So I really appreciated General Allen's framework of US versus American, and I think that that's particularly relevant to this question, because if you look at the most capitalized and largest, and by both user volume and in terms of investment and market share platforms, they are all American platforms. And it is very much the case that both from a US context and an American context, we are not doing enough. And I'd like to see that addressed, because I think General Allen's very right that in other sectors, we do see far greater leadership there in terms of gender representation. So what can the tech sector do? Well, the tech sector can make some hard commitments. If you look around the entire tech sector today, you see a paucity of women on boards, you see a paucity of women in top C-suite position roles. The women who do exist in those roles tend to be confined to either communications or marketing roles. We don't see them in positions of executive decision-making relative to products that they bring to market or policy decisions that they make, or even engaged in government affairs decisions, which I think is really the critical piece here. The tech sector is, because of its size and because of its sort of global footprint, it is largely, I don't want to say unregulated, but it is largely sort of sits above most efforts at broad national regulation, and instead is able to utilize various jurisdictions to be able to put forward whatever policies, data practices it likes, if I'm being a bit generous. And because of this, that particular role relative to government affairs and the ability to bring women to the table around the policies and decision-making that these tech companies are engaged in is of critical importance. So what I would like to see is initiatives like that is one that is a few years old here in the state of California, where I am based, to require at least one minority board member from an underrepresented ethnic group and one minority board member from as a woman, as a very minimum baseline for participation for these publicly traded companies. And then to expand that out, because as we just heard from a number of speakers, minority participation is representatively token participation. So to ensure there are at least 3 people who represent this minority perspective or marginalized perspective in decision-making roles who are accountable to the success and failure of these products, platforms, and their broader impact in society. Because I think that really starts at the top. And then there are a number of different issues relative to the investment in the in the space of access to computer science engineering, the sort of pipeline in terms of dropout of individuals, of women once they get into computer science roles. And so I would also love to see a deeper investment in tertiary education that would enable for women in particular to participate in this really important economic sector with access to the same professional opportunities by making the pipelines more egalitarian through access to schools that are not necessarily traditional engineering schools, and through community college access, which is another really important area relative to recruiting for women and for minority candidates for important roles relative to software production and engineering. So I'd like to see some hard commitments that start at the top and then go all the way to the introduction of new employees. And I think that it's very important that the elected representatives globally, particularly in the EU and the US, who tend to have the most power from a regulatory standpoint, make this a point relative to the regulation of technology companies at a broader scale. Is what does this mean for this particular group of people who many have pointed out are at least 50% of the population in most areas?
Thank you for that. I want to bring in now Ambassador Chowdhury again. Earlier in our conversation, Ambassador O'Neill mentioned that her role has both a domestic and an international role. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what lessons does the Women, Peace and Security framework have that could be implemented here within the United States domestically?
Well, I think all countries stand to benefit from this. We have to understand that gender inequality is a threat to global progress, to humanity's progress, and the rise of patriarchy or existence of patriarchy and misogyny for years have pervaded our societies in all parts of the world, creating a sort of pulling back the people's progress in having equal participation. So I believe that there's something that we can do is to have the UN lead the way. The United Nations this is the resolution of the United Nations. United Nations has the credibility and the universality that message will be carried everything. I believe that not only for the US being one of the permanent 5 members who have contributed to deny a woman Secretary General of the United Nations. We have 9 Secretary General, 75 years. No woman was found to be competent. If we say, it may sound very difficult, but we had even many times before good women candidates. So that is number 1. And I think that will send a message to the world that will tell us that how women's leadership makes the difference. And that is very important. And I also believe that as General Allen have said very rightly, democracy to make progress. You remember in 2011, 3 women got Nobel Peace Prize, and the Nobel Committee cited for the first time any UN resolution in that specific way and mentioning 1325. And it said that to obtain we cannot achieve democracy and lasting peace in the world unless women obtain the same opportunities as men to influence developments at all levels of society. So that is a very crucial point. We have to understand it is women's equality, women's rights are just not for women only. It's good for humanity. And I believe the message that Representative Frankel said, we should all assert, and I am proud to be a feminist. Feminism doesn't mean it's men or women, one against the other. It means that we are following a smart policy of inclusivity. We are bringing everybody in to work together. So that is very important. And I must say that the United Nations also need to show the way. Think of not only the senior management, where thanks to the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, we have been able to get 50-50 parity. But think of the economic parity worldwide. UN report itself said it will take 270 years to reach economic parity, including equal pay. That is very important. And also think of all the field level heads of the UN peacekeeping missions. Very minimum number of them are women, and they are deputies. So we need to take, if I may use the phrase, affirmative action to take care of that gender imbalance everywhere. It is all pervasive. And Secretary General should make it his flagship effort to, I'm told that he is seeking a second term re-election. That will be carrying the day for him. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have a couple more minutes left of this section of our program, so I just want to bring General Allen back in. General Allen, as we look to the security challenges of the future, what do you think are the biggest obstacles for women, peace, and security, and involving that framework and agenda in addressing the security challenges of the future? General Allen?
I think the United States, can you hear me okay, Amy?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Thanks. Evidently, Mount Vernon is a long way from the electrons this morning. One of the things I'm very proud of is that the United States has embraced, in the context of its military doctrine, the whole issue associated with women in peace and security. That shoots through a whole variety of things, and I would hope that because the U.S. in the context of our global involvement on security matters will almost always in the future, in a wisely led country, will almost always be a coalition effort of countries that have similar values. And if we can become an exemplar of a nation where women are fully invested in our security services, whether it's in the intelligence community or in the military itself, certainly I think our foreign service has gone a long way in that regard, then we can become the exemplars that, say, Canada has become for many of us in many respects. So I think it's first and foremost, what are we doing as a society to develop women to take their rightful positions in these kinds of organizations? What are we doing ultimately to change cultures? I worry about something called eventism, which is you'll run into an organization where they're having lots of events that would seem to indicate a commitment to the role of women in a particular organization. And in the end, they're really just events because we haven't changed anything in the big scheme of things. So it requires leadership, and we're seeing that leadership now developing, and it comes from, Amy, as you said, look, we've been at war now in a counterinsurgency environment and a counterterrorism environment now for well over 20 years. And so virtually the entire US military that's older than just a few years old has been through this process. And we have discovered ourselves, apart perhaps from the policy pronouncements of our administration, we've discovered that, of course, we are better for the role of women. We are more effective. We are a greater military that is oriented on the human rights of those with whom we serve. So we have to be an exemplar. And because we'll be in coalitions, we ought to be an exemplar to the other nations in those coalitions. But I think that women, peace, and security has become, in many respects, a very important role within the U.S. military and security services at this point. But again, it goes back to the difference potentially between American institutions and the U.S. government right now. And I know that so many of these institutions are utterly committed to this. And I can remember, coming upon an Afghan woman in Kandahar. And you hear this term all the time. It circulated around the world. And she was in her burqa and she was crying because she'd just been beaten by her husband. And we were trying to protect her. And I couldn't see her face, of course, because she was in that awful garment. And her comment was, "We hold up half the world. Why can't we be treated that way? Half the sky." So I think that the US military has embraced this. We've embraced it as a doctrinal issue, but we've embraced it because of 1325. And if any one thing has ever, I think, made a difference in that regard for the good of our country, with the right kinds of leadership embracing it, and the good of the democracies, and as an example to everyone else who hasn't gotten on board yet, 1325 and a global commitment to it is it. And we ought to be doing everything we can to reinforce it. We ought to be doing everything to celebrate it at the 20-year anniversary and use it as a benchmark for our own reflection as to whether we've been true to the principles.
Thank you very much, General Allen. I think that's a wonderful note to end our conversation on today. Although, don't get me wrong, I could keep you, all three of you, here all day discussing these issues. So before we head to our Q&A, I'm very happy to be joined now by, and actually, sorry, to our panelists, I just want to remind you all to please stay with us for the Q&A in a few minutes. And before we get to that, I'm delighted to now be joined by Sahana Dharmapuri, who heads up the Our Secure Future. She has been a dedicated advocate and advisor on gender, peace, and security issues to USAID, NATO, the Swedish Armed Forces, the United States Institute for Peace, the International Peace Institute, and other international development organizations. Sahana, welcome to the virtual platform. What are your takeaways from the event today? And looking, we've discussed the past 20 years of women, peace, and security, but looking now to the next 20 years, what needs to be done to ensure that the women, peace, and security agenda can be meaningfully implemented?
Thank you, Amy. First, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, our distinguished speakers, for both speaking today, but also, more importantly, for your commitment to gender equality and peace and all the work that you've done on this issue and other issues to promote peace in the world. I think what's very interesting is that all the speakers have commented on the challenges that we have today, but have also found a lot of hope and inspiration in the agenda of 1325 and women, peace, and security. And I find that really actually inspiring for myself as well, because some of the things the speakers have pointed out is, look, this agenda is driven by women in civil society. It has a global constituency. It's focused on gender equality at the center of decision making in order to create a more peaceful world. And frankly, all the speakers have underscored that we cannot have peace or security in this world without the full participation of women. So, I mean, I think that actually, even though the media, current events may tell us that we are living in a time that we really don't have any power in, that we're powerless to change our circumstances, actually, I think the women who initiated this agenda 20 years ago shows something very, very different, which is we can change. We can change this structure that is unequal. We can look to this agenda for fresh ideas to yet fully to be realized, for sure. But this is where I think we can really find a wellspring of hope and courage and inspiration for a sort of grand vision for peace, I think. So I do think that, having a global constituency to promote this issue set is very unique among many other foreign policy agendas. I think the bipartisan support that it enjoys in the US is also really key to this issue being fully implemented by the United States and the different agencies. That's why Our Secure Future has really made it a priority to establish and help establish and support a congressional caucus that is bipartisan. So I think what the speakers have said is also very encouraging and gives us some direction. I think the question for everyone who is joining us and ourselves is, what do we do about it now? And a few things that I noted from what everyone has spoken of are, one is we have globally 80 plus countries that have national action plans, and we really need to support them and fully implement them. In the United States, civil society has worked for years to garner congressional support, which resulted in the passage of the Women, Peace, and Security Law in 2017, which enjoys both Democratic and Republican support. So I think that that's a huge lesson to all of us of how we need to work together to create a more peaceful world. So I think I will just end by saying I really appreciate everyone, all the speakers contributing their perspectives and being on this call, because I think it shows that we need civil society, we need the private sector, we need the military, we need US government actors and other government actors to actually work together in order to realize the potential and the aspirations of this agenda, which are really to reduce violence in this world, to increase protection of the vulnerable, to halt inequalities, and to actively promote gender equality. So I think there's a lot of good news here, Amy. I think that we have the ability, we clearly have the commitment, and we also have a lot of time. We've got the next 20 years to get it done. So I'm leaving this conversation with a lot of hope.
Thank you for ending us on that optimistic note. I'd now like to welcome back all of our previous speakers. If you could please join us for the Q&A session. We've got about 10 minutes for this, so if you could please keep your answers crisp, so we can get through as many of our very insightful questions that we've had from our audience. First, I have a question for Ambassador O'Neill. We've had a lot of let me see, I have a whole list of questions here. We've had a lot of interest in Canada's gender-based analysis plus tool. And for those of you who are watching and who are interested, we've included a link to that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us through Zoom. And so for Ambassador O'Neill, the question we have is from Barbara Langley. Barbara says that she's very interested in the Canadian Gender-Based Analysis Plus tool. Is this available for broader use for non-governmental organizations?
Thanks, and yes, absolutely. There is I shared a link to the main government page where it's online, and then there's a basic introductory course that is available free online for anyone who wants it. And as I mentioned, a number of departments are focused on developing specific tools. So Department of National Defense has some tools that relate to defense procurement, that type of thing. Not all of those are public. So if anyone has specific things that they want, please contact me. I'm best probably through Twitter or something, some other way on here, and I'll share with you what we can. But the basics and the basic elements are online, and we posted them in response to the Q&A and on Twitter.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question is for Congresswoman Frankel, and this comes from Destiny Afu in Cameroon. Destiny asks, in Africa, where gender bias and discrimination against women is very much accepted as part of a norm and a part of a culture, what kind of legislations can governments pass so as to change societal and cultural perspectives to enable women to emancipate and engage more in public affairs and foreign policy? Congresswoman Frankel, are you still with us?
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you for that question. And it's really been great to hear this panel. And General John Allen, I just want to say that today you made me even prouder of the Marines. I've been very proud, but it was so wonderful to hear what you had to say. So here's the point that I tried to make before, and I want to say this again. Women, peace, and security, it's not a silo. Yes, we need more women as peacekeepers, sensitize the diplomats. All this is important, do analysis. But you know what? We need to stop female genital mutilation. We need to stop child marriage. We need to get rid of this horrendous gag rule that our current administration has put on, which is depriving women all over the world of access to reproductive care. That's what's going on. We need to, so what I see in terms of the United States, so many things we can do. Access to health care, especially reproductive care, trying to remove the barriers that keep girls from getting educated. And actually, we also have, this administration has actually put into place some women empowerment strategy, which I think are very, very good. So I think you have to look at girls and women as a whole, not just little pieces of it, and do what we need to do to make sure, as I said, they're educated, they're healthy, they're safe, and they have access to resources for financial stability.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Our next question is for General Allen. This is from Brigadier General retired Kelly Fisher, who is a senior mentor to the U.S. Army War College. The question is, what advice do you have for senior leaders of the armed services of the U.S. military on the importance to incorporate women, peace, and security principles across military strategy and operations?
It can't, and thank you for your service, and I'm glad you are where you are as a mentor, and thank you for that. It can't be an afterthought, is the first thing I would say. I was on the ground in Afghanistan as the commander there in the war effort. A very short time when someone appeared on my calendar to come in and see me. And it was a cell, several women from my planning staff who came in to see me to tell me that they were responsible for ensuring that our orders, our operations orders for combat operations, would have a women's complexion to them. And I'll come back to the term feminism, a feminist complexion. They didn't use that term, but that's the term that I would use. And I realized very quickly in the conversation with them that the women in my headquarters who were responsible for ultimately ensuring that our orders had legitimate feminism in them were given the orders at the very end of the process. Someone would come down the hall and hand them an order, 82nd Airborne Division's off on an operation tomorrow, tell us how we get women in this thing. And I stopped it from that moment on. They were to be at the front end of the development of the orders so that the expertise that they had on these, again, intersectional matters, where it's not just about the woman, it's the tribe, and it's how that element of the society has been deprived, and inequality, and all of the things that needed to be plugged in and baked into the order at the beginning. That's what I learned, Brigadier. That's what I think how we need to mentor our senior leaders, which is where you are today. And that is that the role of women, particularly in our orders processes, can't be an afterthought. It's got to be at the front end of the process. And commanders, smart commanders, ought to be issuing in their commander's guidance of a component of that commander's guidance at the front end before the order is even written that incorporates an absolute expectation by that commander that when she finally gets the order or he gets the order, that order reflects a feminist bent to it. And that's the way we're going to do this. It's got to be, commanders have got to think this way, and commanders have got to insert it at the front end of the planning process. Thank you for that question. That's a good one.
Thank you, General. We have a question now from Swanee Hunt, which I think I'm going to direct to Ambassador Chowdhury. Swanee asks, most donor national action plans are almost all focused on the foreign assistance aspect, do not include much domestic lens. How do you suggest to bridge that gap?
Thank you. Thank you, Swanee, to get your question. I am delighted. We have been working together since the days of 1325 adoption. And I'm very proud to say that we are proud of the role that Ambassador Hunt has brought into this issue. Well, as I have said, and here let me also pay tribute to Ambassador O'Neill. Jackie has been a civil society partner for many years, as Ambassador Hunt had been for my work. And we have worked together to move many obstacles on the side. So thank you, Jackie, for going on with your mission. And thank you, Ambassador Hunt Swanee, for those roles. Let me say that in many cases, the budgetary constraints are there. For developing countries, that constraint is for every sector of society or every sector of governmental work. But the energy and enthusiasm of civil society can come in very handy and really overcome the budgetary factor. I think budget is important, but it is also enthusiasm and determination of civil society which will move the budgetary process away from the current status quo or limiting opportunities. But again, that brings us to the question, who allocates the budgets? It is the parliaments, which are 90% men. And that is a big challenge that we have. So political participation of women at all levels, including parliamentary levels, is very necessary. That is what Canada did in the present government, that they had 50-50 cabinet members on their government. So that is very important, and we should realize that all leaders, women and men and everybody, have to understand that we, in our own way, can advance the agenda for 1325 in a big way.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have time for one final question, and I would like to bring in Sahana for this one. And this question comes from Alexis Henshaw, who asks, given the concerns about women, peace and security becoming performative, I wonder how the participants, or Sahana, and you in your case, assess global leadership on this issue. What makes a country a champion on women, peace and security, and who is leading the way on innovating in this area?
Oh, well, thank you so much for the question. How do we assess global leadership? Well, that's a big question. I think there's quite a number of experts on this this call, this event, that could help me answer that question. Well, I definitely think that we can see leadership in terms of the initiative to take on a national action plan and how they work with civil society, how the governments actually work and engage with civil society to inform those plans. Certainly, having the addition of a budget attached to those national action plans shows a certain level of commitment beyond just creating a paper policy, for example. And I do think that the more that civil society can engage with all the sectors in an open flow of exchange and information is what will show commitment. And I don't think it's a one-time thing. I think what all the speakers have talked about is a process, an evolution, that we are learning together how to do things better together. So equality is a goal that we want to reach together, and it's not going to happen overnight. But we can do things like using the Gender Analysis Plus tool. We can ask the questions that General Allen posed to the Brigadier. We can actually champion civil society the way Ambassador Chowdhury has been talking about. You know, Congresswoman Frankel's leadership with Congressman Welch's leadership on the Congressional Caucus is another great opening to show leadership both as ordinary citizens, that how we can engage in those things through civil society, but also engaging with our governments. So that's my sort of short answer.
Thank you, Sahana. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for today. So we're going to have to wrap it up here. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly leaving this discussion with lots of food for thought. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished speakers. We really appreciate you spending the time with us this morning. And thank you for sharing your expertise and perspectives on this topic. And thank you also for your leadership on these very important issues. And of course, a big thank you to our audience as well. We've had hundreds of people join us today. It's a pleasure to have such an engaged and thoughtful audience turning out for our virtual dialogues. And while we miss being able to bring everyone together in person, we certainly appreciate the ability to reach all of you virtually and bring together the truly global gatherings of people who are experts, leaders, and influencers on these important issues. And thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you all in person in the future. And please do stay tuned for upcoming virtual events here at Foreign Policy, including our annual Her Power Summit next week. You'll see a slide popping up on your screen for that now. That's October 14th to 15th. It's going to be a 2-day digital event. Her Power is Foreign Policy's flagship Global Women's Summit, which was launched last year with enormous success. And we are excited to continue the momentum this year with 2 high-powered days of inspiring conversations about gender equality and women's leadership in the foreign policy areas. And we have many more virtual dialogues to come for this fall. For more information, you can go to our event page. That's foreignpolicy.com/events. Thank you everyone again for joining. Take care, stay well, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon. Bye-bye.